The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guests or hosts are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. We are all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. In each episode, we will feature very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to live their best lives naturally. Good day and welcome back to Supplementing Health. If you're anything like me, you appreciate a sweet treat from time to time. However, the estimated average of daily sugar consumption in North America is around 42.5 teaspoons, where the recommended daily amount is between 6 to 9 teaspoons per day, according to the American Heart Association. We regularly hear about the detrimental effects of too much sugar, so today I am thrilled to introduce Saul Katz, CEO of Solo Nutrition, to explore how sugar negatively affects our health, along with the ways that we can tailor our diets to reduce these risks. Welcome, Saul.
Hi, nice to be here.
Okay, so before we dive in, I would love to know how you got started on your journey and became passionate about health and wellness.
I started it with the University of Alberta. I started a company with the University of Alberta Hospitals to develop foods to promote health, prevent disease, enhance performance. And then I started Solo GI Nutrition, which is based on the glycemic index, and working with Dr. Jenkins and Williver at the University of Toronto to help to be disruptive and to help get society back on track and, to address obesity and diabetes. So that's how I got into this.
That's awesome. Diabetes is one of those health conditions that comes to mind when we start talking about excess sugar intake. There is often a link between diabetes and obesity, which has led to the term diabesity, coined in 1970 to describe the interrelatedness of these two conditions. Knowing this, can you share why there is an interest in diabesity and speak to its connection to increased sugar intake?
Obesity and diabetes are related to sugar and particularly blood sugar. So it's this interrelationship between the two that's really driving these interlinked epidemics of obesity and diabetes. And in North America, it's so bad that 70% of the population are either overweight or obese, and 9 out of 10 people who are obese are also diabetic, so that reinforces that relationship. And it's getting worse because 1 in 3 people are living with diabetes, about 10% of the population, and the rest are pre-diabetic, and 90% of those don't even know it. 95% of the people diagnosed with diabetes are type 2. They're not born with it. So it has to do with our lifestyle and our diet that are driving these epidemics. So it's really important to understand why this trend is continuing to grow and what we could do to reverse it.
Okay, so carbs are often villainized in diet culture due to the fact that our bodies convert carbohydrates into sugars. However, they do play an important role in fueling our brain, kidneys, heart muscles, and central nervous system. So from your perspective, does this view of carbs need to shift? And if yes, how so?
So there's a lot of confusion about sugar and carbs. So sugar is a carb as our fibers. And all carbs, whether sugar or starch or fiber, are primarily a source of fuel to the body. So the source of the problem is not sugar or carbs, but rather the rate at which glucose enters the bloodstream. You see, refined sugars and highly processed foods and carbs are digested and converted by the body into glucose quickly, spiking blood sugar levels. So what happens is that provokes the pancreas to release a flood of insulin to store the extra blood sugar as fat. And if our blood sugar falls too fast, that's the crash, our hunting hormones kick in and release adrenaline, testosterone, and cortisol to get our blood sugars back up again. That's the crave. So we're in this vicious spike, crash, and crave cycle that's significantly contributing to the interlinked epidemics of obesity and diabetes as the body uses more and more insulin to store more and more glucose into fat. And that could lead to insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome as the beta cells in the pancreas become exhausted and can't produce any more insulin. That leads to type 2 diabetes.
So if sugar and carbs are not the source of the problem, then what is driving diabetes?
Firstly, we need to take a long view and consider that our body and our digestive system is the result of about 2.5 million years of evolution. 99% of that is human history. So really, it's just in the past 500,000 years or so that our genetics evolved in a hunter-gatherer environment. And in that situation, there was feast and famine. So the spike, crash, and crave really evolved as a metabolic survival mechanism using insulin as the master fat storage hormone to help our ancestors store energy in what we call fat to help them get through the lean times. So we basically have inherited, that survival mechanism. And that's because in a feast and famine environment, when our ancestors came across something sweet, they saw it as a source of fast and easy energy. So they're really habituated, to consume as much of that sweet food as possible to conserve as much of that energy because fruits were basically seasonal. Now, ironically, that same survival mechanism is now compromising health and driving the interlinked epidemics of obesity and diabetes. You see, the foods and the carbs in particular that we're eating today are a lot different than our ancestors ate. The source of their carbs were bark and roots and unripened fruits and vegetables, which take about 22 feet of the small intestine, our full intestine, to digest and absorb and assimilate those carbs into glucose, which is blood sugar. So their carbs were released slowly into the system. But the refined sugars and highly processed carbs we eat today are really easily digested by the body. So they get assimilated into our bloodstream within inches of the small intestine instead of the 22 feet, spiking our blood sugar and starting that vicious cycle, the spike, crash, and crave. And so now we're using more and more insulin to store more and more calories as fat for starvation periods that don't come. And in the process of continually taxing the pancreas for more and more insulin, the beta cells get exhausted and can't produce anymore. And that's type 2 diabetes.
So according to this theory, what type of foods should we be avoiding?
While our genes haven't changed, our environment has. So the foods we eat today are very different from the Stone Age, and they're available year-round. Our ancestors didn't hunt in stores. They pursued their food, and they didn't eat refined carbs. Another disconnect is that our digestive tract was designed for the Stone Age. So our intestines evolved to be really powerful extractors of glucose from the roots of the barks. And that results in a super rapid absorption of refined carbs and a mismatch between our intestines' ability to absorb the glucose and the body's ability to handle it. Also, over the past 40 years, diabetes has accelerated at a tremendous pace as the big food companies are competing to develop on-the-go foods. So what they do is they take the whole grains and mill them into fine powders and syrups to sweeten and glue these processed foods together, and in the process, driving that vicious spike and crash and crave with caloric density. So the types of foods we need to be eating are foods that are more whole, more natural, and our carbs are derived from them. So there's natural sugars in milk, in fruit, and in grains that are in the right quantity, but they're also bound up with fiber and fats and protein, so it takes longer for our body to digest them. And they're not super concentrated sugars.
The paleo diet has been built around the idea that our digestive system is developed for the way our ancestors ate, which you've previously mentioned in this conversation. But in that diet, grains, refined sugars, and legumes aren't really permitted, as they're seen as not something that our ancestors would eat. So in your opinion, can we include carbohydrates in our diet that won't spike our blood sugar?
So as I mentioned, eating carbs is not the real issue. What we have to think about when we select a food or beverage is not only the quantity of the sugar being consumed, and less is better, but also how fast will the carbs get converted to blood sugar, and slower is better. Slow release carbs or sugars are found in whole foods like fruits, vegetables, grains, and milk. But the problem really stems from the consumption of free, unbound sugars added by manufacturers to our food supply. And those tantalize our taste buds and contribute to excess calories. So it's estimated that about 75% of the foods on the grocery shelves have these free added sugars, and they're under different aliases on the label. Now, the biggest problem is drinking carbs. All of the unhealthy effects of processed and sugar-enriched foods are amplified in sugar-sweetened beverages. So, and not only that, but sugary drinks don't satisfy hunger, so they significantly inflate our daily caloric intake, and the sugars they contain meet almost no digestive resistance before inundating the blood and the liver. So these are, what we need to avoid are beverages and soft drinks, fruit drinks, sport drinks, even coffee and tea if they have too much sugar in them, which add about 47% of all the added sugar. And then snacks and sweets are the next biggest contributor that add about 31% of the sugars in our diet.
Okay, now researchers have found that more than 82% of the population exceeds the recommended 10% of calories from sugars. Science has shown that eating sugar releases opioids and dopamine in our bodies, which is an important chemical messenger in the brain involved in the reward and pleasure centers, among other things. Some of the studies have even suggested that sugar can be as addictive as cocaine. Can you explain these addictive qualities that sugar has?
So what's really important is to not eliminate carbs, but to eat low glycemic carbs that are released slowly in the bloodstream. And also, more physical activity helps to burn up the carbs and store more sugar or glucose as glycogen. And that's really the key to managing our weight, sustaining our energy, and preventing disease. See, if people know a little about carbs, a little about insulin and blood sugar, but when we understand the evolutionary story of the spike, crash, and crave, we could see that eating foods that the body converts into blood sugar slowly, like fuel injection, helps to sustain our energy, prevent the physiological spike, crash, and crave, and helps us to manage our weight.
What are the signs and symptoms of eating too much sugar?
In the hunter-gatherer environment, our body and brain was programmed to binge and gorge on these sweet foods, but times have changed. And there's a big disconnect in relation to the types of foods that we have. And sweet foods are now cheap and abundant, and the sugar in them is often heavily concentrated and high glycemic, so it enters our bloodstream really quickly. But unfortunately, the brain's evolution hasn't kept up the pace, so the onslaught of sugar in the bloodstream is really overwhelming our metabolism and our digestive system. And it isn't adapted to today's environment. So the sugar in food today is unlike anything our physiology has experienced before. Combinations of carbohydrates in pizza, in ice cream, and fries, and sodas, they all lack fiber, which you never find in a natural food environment. Not only that, but the taste receptors in the tongue are specialized in detecting sweet And they send signals to our lower brain, our primordial brain, and also signals from our gut to be excited, about tasting these sweets, which triggers dopamine in our brain to adapt our behavior to seek out sugars and consume them. Also, the vagus nerve is triggered in the body when we eat something sweet, and that was associated with fight or flight and rest and relaxation, which is why we feel good after we eat sugar and why some people eat to cope with anxiety or to deal with a bad day at work. So it's no wonder that sugary foods trigger a sense of not just pleasure, but also of safety and security. And it's no wonder they're also so addictive. So as I mentioned, like our brain circuitry is still programmed to eat more in times of food abundance in preparation for periods of starvation. In other words, the human brain still regards sugar as a preciously scarce source of energy and a nutrient that's best consumed copiously. Well, in addition to driving that spike, crash, and crave and gaining more weight and taxing the pancreas for more insulin, decades of research have linked diets high in refined sugars and processed carbs to inflammation, metabolic disease, heart problems, and forms of cancer. In particular, sugar promotes glycation. These glycated molecules produce toxic compounds called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, and that essentially throw the aging process into fast forward. And much of the damage that's done by AGEs is irreversible. And as I mentioned, sugar raises insulin levels. So the constant amount of insulin in the system causes our cells to become numb to insulin's effect, and that causes insulin resistance, which requires the pancreas to use and send out more and more insulin to do its job, which leads to, type 2 diabetes. And along the way, too much insulin in the system exposes our cells and organs to chronically high levels of insulin, which accelerates the aging process. Sugar also reduces our sleep quality. So studies have shown that consuming more sugar is linked to more restlessness and disrupted sleep, and we can't really get into that relaxed dream state. Sugar also promotes carb cravings. So if you find yourself craving, a sweet flavor or a sugary snack on a daily basis, chances are you've become addicted to sugar. And consumption of too much sugar can weaken the immune system, making your body's natural ability to fight off colds, flus, and viruses, even chronic disease, weaker than if you would have avoided eating those sugars. And just as eating a lot of sugar can make your body physically crash, it can also drain you emotionally, so it could increase the feelings of anxiety and depression. Sugar has inflammatory effects on the body when it's eaten, so it could contribute to, skin problems, acne, eczema, or just excessive oiliness or dryness. High amounts of sugar are implicated in high blood pressure, and of course, dental caries or teeth issues. Sugar likes to work its way into the nooks and crannies in your teeth, where it can rot away at the tooth enamel. And sugar has been implicated with heart disease, and the inflammation caused by sugar, that's been linked to cardiovascular disease, because it's not just the cholesterol blocking the arteries, it's the artery walls becoming inflamed and narrowing the passage of blood and nutrients.
So knowing all of the effects sugar has on the body and that it's our body's ideal form of fuel, how do we know when we're getting too much of a good thing?
On average, Canadians eat 110 grams of sugar per day. That's 26 teaspoons, or about 20% of our total energy intake. And that's based on a 2,000 calorie a day diet. And over the course of a year, the average American child between the age of 4 and 8 consumes a staggering 50 pounds of sugar. In some cases, that's equivalent to their body weight, which is crazy. And because of that, it's projected that 1 in 2 children will develop diabetes during their lifetime if we stay on this track. Now, Diabetes Canada and the American Diabetes Association support the World Health Organization recommendations to reduce the consumption of free sugars for adults and children to less than 10% of the total daily calorie intake. That's approximately 50 grams or 12 teaspoons of free sugar, or the amount of 120-ounce bottle of soda based on a 2,000 calorie diet. And if you're overweight or have a risk factor for heart disease or diabetes, it might also be wise to keep it below 5%. So we're talking about the reduction of free sugar. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't consume, fruit, the sugars that are in fruit and milk and yogurts and grains, because those are in a natural balance in whole foods that nature intended. It's the free sugar that adds caloric density, contributes to our weight, and is driving diabetes.
If you're experiencing symptoms from eating sugar, does that mean you are pre-diabetic?
So many people are pre-diabetic and don't even realize it. So if you find yourself constantly thirsty or hungry in spite of eating or drinking regularly, and feel flushed after a sugar binge, or extremely weak or off when you skip a meal, you might want to talk to your doctor about the diabetes risk. Another thing to be on the lookout for are the symptoms associated with metabolic syndrome, which may precede type 2 diabetes, and that's a cluster of factors including high blood sugar, high cholesterol and triglycerides, and a high waist circumference. As type 2 diseases set in, it starts to silently damage blood vessels and nerves, and people with diabetes who don't get diagnosed early have a much higher risk of the complications, including eye problems, kidney disease, neurological damage, and even amputation. So make sure you have a recent lipid panel and glucose test and your numbers fall within the normal range. But don't forget that type 2 diabetes can be reversed, especially if diagnosed early, with the right diet and moderate exercise.
And how does sugar impact our immune system?
Well, sugar suppresses the immune system. Research has shown that consuming 75 to 100 grams of sugar can hinder the body's immune function. So a 12-ounce can of Coca-Cola, which contains 39 grams, or a grand chai latte from Starbucks containing 42 grams, could get you more than halfway to lowering your immunity. So when you consume a big dose of sugar, like a bottle of Coke or a candy bar, you temporarily dampen your immune system's ability to respond to challenges. And it relates particularly to your white blood cells. Those are known as the killer cells, and they're highly affected by the consumption of too much sugar. It's believed that white blood cells aren't able to do their job and destroy the bad bacteria, the viruses, when someone eats too much sugar. We also talked about how sugar promotes inflammation, and inflammation is part of our immune system, which isn't always a bad thing. But eating sugary foods could promote low-grade chronic inflammation, and that could contribute to disease states like cardiovascular disease and diabetes.
How long do the effects of sugar on the immune system last?
So the effects last for several hours. So if you eat sweets several times a day, your immune system might perpetually be operating, at a disadvantage. So your immune system could be suppressed, as soon as 30 minutes after consuming sugar, and it could last up to 5 hours. So if you're eating snacks and sweets several times a day, you could be reducing your immune system on an ongoing basis, which is a real distinct disadvantage.
We know sugar can feed certain bacteria. How does adjusting sugar intake affect the microbiome?
Well, your gut also plays a really important role in your immune health. And research suggests that consuming sugar can disrupt the gut microbiome and may lead to inflammatory bowel disease, IBD, and Crohn's disease. The coating on our intestinal walls plays a huge part of our immune system. which protects us from a lot of bad things in the food that we eat from penetrating. And too much sugar in the system allows the bacteria or viruses to propagate much more because our own system doesn't work as well. That's why people with diabetes, for example, have more infections. And this might also explain why inflammatory bowel disease is really prevalent in Western countries and increasingly found among younger people.
With sugars being used more frequently in food manufacturing, there can be sneaky sources of free sugars in our diets. Do you have any tips for listeners on ways they can identify these?
Manufacturers have really done a good job at hiding sugars in our foods under different names. At last count, there's about 56 names. But soon, regulations will require food manufacturers to list the amount of added sugar on nutritional facts label on products. Listing the total amount of added sugar means that consumers will no longer have to search through the many different aliases for added sugars to try to determine how much added sugar a food or drink contains.
Many people have replaced classic sugars with artificial sweeteners. Does this actually have a positive impact on the body?
Sugar substitutes seem like a good idea for weight loss, but they can actually backfire on you. As I mentioned, your brain is wired to associate sweet foods with carbohydrate energy. So in anticipation or while consuming a sweetened food or beverage, your body responds with that flood of insulin from the pancreas. So even though you're not getting energy, right, with these artificial sweeteners, your body thinks you are. So it sends out this flood of insulin to take sugar out of the blood, so it may actually drop your blood sugar levels and cause a craving for more food. Also, artificial sweeteners, such as sugar alcohols, are carbohydrates that have been chemically altered not to be recognized or digestible by the body. So manufacturers use them in low-carb food products because they don't show up as sugar on the label. But because they've been chemically altered and can't get digested, they often cause stomach upset and gas as they pass through the body. So check the ingredient list. Foods labeled no sugar added or sugar-free almost always contain artificial sweeteners. Low-carb products often do as well. And the most commonly used sweeteners are sucralose, which is the generic name for Splenda, aspartame, which is also sold as Equal and NutraSweet.
Throughout our conversation, you've mentioned eating low GI. What exactly is the glycemic index or the GI of eating low GI?
The glycemic index is really a great new scientific tool that measures how long it takes the body to convert a carbohydrate into glucose, which is blood sugar. So it determines how fast and how high blood sugar raises after consuming a carb-containing product. And that helps consumers understand how a particular food could impact their blood sugar. And it also helps manufacturers to develop products that allow for a slow conversion of carbs into blood sugar. So it's a great solution to get us back on track by eating foods as nature intended that are to have the carbohydrates converted to sugar slowly instead of causing that vicious spike, crash, and crave. And it's another great Canadian invention, just like insulin was developed at the University of Toronto by Beth and Banting. Dr. Jenkins and Dr. Woolever developed the glycemic index at the University of Toronto to help people manage their diabetes through food as opposed to medication. And how Dr. Jenkins discovered this was he saw that a mashed potato raises blood sugar faster than table sugar, whereas table sugar used to be considered a simple sugar, mashed potato complex. By heating the potato and mashing it, it makes it a lot easier for the body to convert the carbs in the potato into blood sugar. So he invented the glycemic index in order for us to be able to rank, which foods are better than the others. Now, In the world's largest diet study conducted in Europe called Diogenes, they wanted to see if there's a genetic predisposition to obesity and diabetes. That's why it's called Diogenes. They found that the only diet that prevents gaining weight after you lose it is a diet that is based on the glycemic index, so a low glycemic diet with a little more protein. And that's because if blood sugar is kept level, our primordial brain believes that food is in abundance and is consistent year round. So there's no need to take more resources out of nature and to put more fat on our body for starvation times that never come. A low glycemic diet allows for that slow release of sugar into the bloodstream. So as a result of that, you could get sustained energy for your body and your brain. That's why a lot of athletes, like that sustained energy. And it's great for solving problems in mental acuity because your brain uses different hormones to either put sugar in the blood or take sugar out of the blood. And associated with those hormones, you get different emotions. So when your blood sugar crashes, you release hunting hormones. And I believe that emotionally predisposes you to kill the bunny for survival. That's when you get hangry. And that, while it helped our ancestors, it doesn't behoove us, in our modern state, in our office or at home, to get hangry with the people around us. That low glycemic release also prevents that physiological spike and crash and crave. So it's not a question of willpower. It's a physiological drive that forces you to crash and crave more food. So that helps prevent that. And your energy also follows your blood sugar. So as I mentioned, you have nice steady energy. And also, because of the nature of low glycemic foods, they're typically bound up, with protein and fat and fiber. So they're more nutritionally balanced, promoting satiety and hunger satisfaction. That means you could manage your weight without having to limit the amount of foods you eat because they're naturally, they naturally promote satiety.
Most often we hear about eating a low GI diet in context of diabetes or prediabetes, but others can actually benefit from adopting this diet as well. Isn't that correct?
Everyone should eat like they're diabetic because it's healthier. It could improve your physical and mental performance and maintain your health and prevent that aging process. Low glycemic foods, as I mentioned, is good for managing your weight, so it's great for dieters. It's shown to help pregnant women to prevent gestational diabetes, and to prevent the infant that's born from having a predisposition to obesity and diabetes. It's also good for athletes, weekend warriors, and students at school. So everyone really should be consuming low glycemic foods. We have to get back on track, with eating foods as nature designed them and intended our bodies to consume them.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you for taking the time to chat with me. It has been a very enlightening conversation, learning about the ins and outs of how sugar affects us. And I also want to thank our listeners who tuned in today. I look forward to having you join me again next week to learn more ways that you can supplement your health.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Supplementing Health. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcast or aor.us/podcast. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic or email us at marketing@aor.ca.